you have any POC projects?
It's been a good business, right? Yeah, it's been
Good evening. I'm Robert Lieberman, the Provost of the University, and I'm really delighted to be here on this beautiful evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this first installment, the premiere, if you will, of what we're calling DigIT. That's short for Digital Innovation Talks. These talks are really the brainchild of Pam Jeffries, our Vice Provost for Digital Initiatives, and her faculty advisory committee, many of whom I've seen tonight. They're designed to draw us all really into the digital world. And I think you'll see some real innovation and some innovative thought and ideas tonight. For starters, they're short, which is by itself an innovation. We all come from a profession where the natural métier is a 50-minute lecture. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's little bite-sized presentation. Like the TED Talks, on which, can I say that without violating copyright? Like the TED Talks, on which Pam and her colleagues modeled these talks. So short, punchy, to the point, clear, and impactful. They also promise to be timely, inspiring, entertaining, and demonstrative. We're going to hear some music tonight. So I'm really looking forward to what we're going to hear. So with that, I just want to welcome you all and introduce tonight's real host, my colleague, Vice Provost for Digital Initiatives, Dr. Pam Jeffries. Pam was appointed to, not yet. Pam was appointed to this position in the Provost's office in last November, almost a year ago, into a new position that we created as we are entering the new an increasingly important world of digital education, to lead and counsel university faculty, staff, and students on digital initiatives and their role in education, and on the ever-increasing and fast-changing uses of new and emerging technologies in the education space. In her role in my office, Pam works with a number of advisory boards, stakeholder groups that cut across the entire campus, engaging faculty, staff, students all across a wide range of really important issues. Under her leadership, these groups are advising us, the university leadership, in the area of digital education. And they offer resources such as these DigIT talks tonight to support, guide, and I dare say inspire those who are endeavoring to enhance and expand the Johns Hopkins experience, both here on campus and inside the university, inside the classroom, outside the classroom, and to the wider digital world. As many of you probably know, Pam is also a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing, where she previously served as the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. She's nationally known for her research and work in developing simulations and online teaching and learning in nursing education. Throughout the academic community, she's well regarded for her expertise in experiential learning, innovative teaching strategies, new pedagogies, and the delivery of content using technology in nursing education, So I hope you'll agree, I know you'll agree that she's the ideal person to be leading these initiatives here at the university. So please welcome Vice Provost Dr. Peabody Conservatory.
Thank you, Provost Lieberman, and welcome for this exciting evening to all the program planners and all the audience out there. I'm very excited because this is an inaugural night for DigIT. But first of all, I want to thank my faculty advisory board that's here and would like for you to stand if you could. I've got several faculty advisory members here, and they represent all the divisions across the university. Can we give them a hand? So how this event started was from the faculty advisory board, and that's why I had them to stand. We had a retreat last April and looked at what are the priorities in the digital education initiative world. And what came up was good teaching, good education, quality education, and how to do that. And faculty development came to the top. With that said, with a lot of planning and discussion, they want faculty-driven faculty development. So tonight is the inaugural time it's faculty-driven with 3 key faculty members tonight talking about their innovations using technology and good teaching. So with that, before we dig in any further, I would also like to invite and introduce the Program Planning Committee. That's a separate committee that came off the advisory. And I would like for each to stand. Harry Goldberg, School of Medicine, who's going to be our MC tonight. Got Michael Falk, School of Engineering, and one of our guest speakers, Tina Ravinema, she's from School of Nursing and is traveling. Charles Lim, School of Medicine and Peabody. Candace Dalrymple from Center of Educational Resources. Brian Caffel, School of Public Health. Linda DeLibrio, Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. And we have Brenda Henry from Policy and Analyst from Garland Hall. So can we give them a hand? We brainstormed this in a matter of 5-6 weeks, and we had fun doing it. So I will turn this over to Dr. Harry Goldberg, our MC, but welcome and please enjoy yourself.
Welcome. So we talk about improving the way we teach, whether we use complex technology and big data or small group discussions and fireside chats. You all are the experts. You all are the experts that will help propel Hopkins to be a more magical place than it is already. In fact, the reason we teach is because we're passionate about transferring our knowledge to others so that we can make our community more productive, more collaborative, and more caring. Yet, we face challenges to our success. For example, we're often haunted sometimes by the fact that some students are more concerned about their grades than their learning. In this example, I'm going to ask you how is taxoline causal? If we look at this third sentence there, the answer is Procrastinians gesticulate large amounts of Phevan and Bracter to causal taxoline. So obviously the answer is that it's Bracter, but no learning is taking place. On the flip side, we have another problem, and that is we have the forgetting curve to worry about. If we compare retention rates with time, you can see the curve drops dramatically in a matter of minutes, days, and weeks. Some of us are addressing this issue by placing learning in context. Others using small group discussion, or in fact, large group discussion. We can't forget peer instruction, nor can we forget the use of simulations, virtual patients, and laboratories to make learning apply. And of course, there's the great lecture. And this is something not to be forgotten because, as you'll see, students are often appreciative of our efforts when it comes to lecturing. My last thought here is that in order to teach well, we have to think about how we learn. In this very simplified diagram of cognitive processing, we see we have 3 sections. The input section, the working memory section, and long-term memory section. Look at the very first, the visual system, as an example. We see we have diagrams and cartoons, photographs, video, for example, all supplying input. The height of the bars there represent the amount of cognitive processing that goes on with each of those elements. So, for example, cartoons require less cognitive horsepower than, say, three-dimensional videos with high animations. This content then goes into short-term memory, where it's aggregated. And the problem is, if we have too much information going into short-term memory, you have information overflow, learnings decline, retention rates decline. And then we move on to long-term memory. So the question is, how we improve our teaching? And we're lucky enough to have three leaders in the field catalyzing our discussion tonight. Michael Falk, Charles Lim, and Thomas Dolby. Michael's going to start by talking about purposeful teaching that is integrating fields that are quite diverse to improve student outcomes. So without further ado, Michael.
Okay. So I think I have to switch the presentations.
While Michael's switching the presentation, we're going to have a few minutes of Q&A when Michael's finished. And then Charles at the same time to go out and swap computers.
Okay, so to start off, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm going to talk to you today about programming, computer programming. And I actually learned computer programming not far from here in Maryland Hall when I was an undergraduate here at Johns Hopkins University. And at the time, in the mid-'80s, I never dreamed I would open for Thomas Dolby. And, you know, learning computer programming was kind of a dream for me because I had been a hobbyist, a computer hobbyist in high school before even getting to Hopkins. And so then I got, I should turn down the sound, otherwise this next slide will be down. Okay, so we finally got to my computer programming class, and we got to do really exciting things like sort numbers, like multiply matrices, and like teach our computer to play tic-tac-toe. I'm actually lying. I wasn't really so into any of these examples. I thought they were really boring, and I had really been hoping that by the time I got to take my first formal introduction to computer programming, I would get to see really what people use computers for. So fast forward 15 years, and I had just started an assistant professorship at the University of Michigan, and everything was going swimmingly. The problem was I really enjoyed teaching, and my chair found out about this. And so he came to me and said, "Oh, Michael, we have a job for you. We could really use somebody to teach Engine 101, the Intro to Computer Programming class that every incoming engineer at the University of Michigan, all 1,300 of them, have to take." This is taught in 6 sections, each of 220 students. So this was the class that was handed to me as a third-year assistant professor. And I, at least going into this, thought, okay, I'm not going to like repeat the sins of my 40s, right? I'm going to come up with at least some examples I can teach these kids that will show that computing is not only like an interesting, important skill that has some fundamental principles behind it, but it's also something that really helps people, that uncovers new knowledge, right? That helps us do things we couldn't otherwise do. So I'm going to quickly run through 3 examples of things I taught in that class, which is, remember, it's a first semester freshman class. They're really just off the boat. And so let's go through that. So, okay, so class, your job this week is to model how HIV disease progresses in a patient. And so you're going to model HIV, the rate at which it infects T cells, how T cells then die, and in the process proliferate and create more HIV. And this model will come from a science paper from 1996, in which the viral life cycle of HIV was presented in mathematical form. Okay? And then what you're going to do with that model, once you've implemented it, is test out different proposed drug therapies in order to provide feedback to a hypothetical clinician about whether you think their clinical intervention will work. Okay, next week. Next week, your project is to build your own carbon nanotubes. So carbon nanotubes form the basis of a whole new field of material science, nanotechnology, because they have exceptional mechanical and electronic properties. But you can't even begin to simulate a carbon nanotube until you can describe inside the computer what the structure of the carbon nanotube is. So you're going to build a geometrical model of a carbon nanotube with various chiralities, which are what determine the shape, the structure of the carbon nanotube, and that'll be the project for this week. Next week, Okay, so your job this week is to investigate ventricular fibrillation, right? So you're going to simulate how a wave moves through heart tissue, particularly a wave of electrical stimulation and the depletion that follows the electrical stimulation. And the hope will be that once you do that, you can run a simple simulation that simulates the wave in the heart tissue in a very simple 2D way, but then also can produce very strange spiral waves that self-perpetuate and that are at the heart of what causes this killing. So these were some examples that I had worked on when I was at University of Michigan. And then, so fast forward 10 years, I came to Hopkins in the material science department here. And we had a real issue, I think, in the material science department. And that was that we felt, I think there was a broad feeling in the department that computing was important, but there was no sense in which computing was really integrated into the curriculum. We told the students, take a computer programming class, take it whenever. Take it over in the computer science department, don't bother us about it. And of course, that set us up for never being able to have them use computing in any way at any of their classes, right? Because you could never know whether a set of students had taken or not taken computer programming. So what we did was we took computer programming into our department, and we made it a required course for all second semester students in material science, using those examples and other examples like them I was just showing you. So students would spend their time doing disciplinarily grounded examples, right? Learning to program, but learning to program in some kind of context. And I think that's really key to what I'll talk to you about right now. And then what we did was we deployed modules, so self-contained sort of one-week exercises that were inserted in the 6 core classes that students take subsequently in their sophomore and junior years. And so these are the 6 core classes, and we had a variety of different kinds of examples, some of which involved programming their computer to do, let's say, a kinetic Monte Carlo model of magnetism, or perhaps using commercial software that they might encounter if they become a professional engineer to look at how bars change shape when they're subjected to large stress. And so they would encounter these computational examples routinely as they went through their core work. So the nice thing was, around this time, I became acquainted with Alejandro Magana, who's an education colleague from Purdue University, and we applied for some money to the National Science Foundation, and they were nice enough to give us the money. And the money was for testing this innovation. And we tested it in 2 particular ways. We used what's called the technology acceptance model, which is sort of cited down here, which says, so this is in the education literature, and what it says is if you want to know whether a group of people are going to adopt a particular technology, you should survey them and ask, do they feel they have the ability to use it? Do they feel it's useful? And do they actually have the intention to use it? So that doesn't seem so mind-blowing, but we've never surveyed our students about that before. In addition, during the modules in the core classes, we implemented pre and post ad hoc assessments, so simple multiple choice tests that students would take before and after the modules to determine whether the module had helped them understand basic core concepts in material science. So let me tell you what we learned from that process. So the first thing we learned was that students who had taken, so CPMSE is our acronym for this first year computing course within material science, computation and programming for material scientists and engineers. And so these are graphs of the student's self-described ability, utility, and intention of using computing compared to students who hadn't taken any other computing background, to students who had taken 1, 2, or even 3 to 4 prior computing classes. And I think we were really shocked that the students who had seen computing in context, and this is before they'd taken any of the modules, were reporting much higher levels of their self-perception of ability to use, of their perception of the utility of using computing, and of their intention to incorporate it both into their studies and their career. There was a second finding that we found very satisfying, which was that we found that students who had taken the CPMSE course also showed higher learning gains students in the pre-post assessments during the core class modules. So they seemed, because they had this preparation, they were better able to use the computing to leverage their knowledge of material science. But there was a third thing we learned that was a little bit less intuitive and a little bit more surprising. And that was you could group the modules that we had implemented in the core classes into two basic types, what we call transparent and what we call black box. So transparent, we would give them a code and say, here's a code, look through this code, learn this code, understand this code, maybe change something about this code, and then use it to simulate something about what you're studying in class this week. In this case, wave packet, quantum wave packet, while they're understanding optical and electronic materials. The black box, we would hand them a piece of software, like something that they might use in industry, like thermocalc in this case, and say, okay, use this, generate a phase diagram, and then use the phase diagram to analyze a particular system. What we found was that students that in the modules where we asked students to use the black boxes, they actually learned a lot more about their disciplinary content than when we handed them a program and asked them to actually get into the guts and understand in detail what the program was doing while they were learning. So we wanted to understand why, and we took students into what we call think-alouds. So we would have a student come in, we'd replicate something that looked like what they had done in class, and verbally think through what they were doing while they were doing it. And we took transcripts and we analyzed the transcripts to try to figure out what was going on. And so this is the sort of picture I have about what we're asking students to do after looking through these think-alouds. So students come into your class, they have some prior knowledge, right? And some of that prior knowledge is correct, right? And some of that prior knowledge, correct prior knowledge, is actually relevant, right? And so we want them to understand the concept, and we're hoping they're making connections, but some of the connections they're making is to incorrect knowledge. Some of it is to knowledge that may be correct but may be totally irrelevant. And we want them, by struggling with the concept, to try to make a strong model in their mind of whatever the concept is in their discipline. And how do we do that? Well, in engineering, we do that by presenting them with an engineering system and saying, okay, we want you to use your concept, your mental understanding, to map this engineering system to some mathematical model, and then solve the mathematical model, and then again, using your concept, map it back to the engineering system so you can make some prediction about what the engineering system does. This is a pretty standard engineering activity. So how are we changing this when we put in the computing? Well, suddenly we're saying, okay, it's not enough for you to map from the engineering system to the math. We also want you to map from the math to some algorithm, some computing construct, and then using this computing artifact, map back to the engineering system from the data that's generated by the computing artifact. And so what happens when you do this, and Harry already alluded to this, is what's termed in the educational literature as cognitive overload. And so I think it's important to realize that we are asking students to do very complex things. And so where this project has led us, and this is still a unfolding story, is that we're trying to think about how do we build scaffolds, how do we build structures that students can use while they're doing this complex learning process so that they can offload some of the mental work that it takes to do a very complex task. So maybe something that would help them with the computing when they're thinking about the engineering, or help them with the math when they're thinking about the computing. And so I think the takeaway message is really that it's important, of course, to teach students how to do something, but I think it's also important if you want them to put in the extra work that it takes to do something so complicated, to learn something with so many moving pieces, to also make sure to teach them why. And I think that's the takeaway message from this project.
That was terrific. Reminds me that back in the late 70s, early 80s, we almost lost the East Coast when 3 Mile Island melted down. And the reason it almost melted down is because the people at the control center had 2 levers they could pull. One had the Miller, this is true, one had the Miller insignia on it, the other had the Budweiser insignia on it. And they were going to pull one when they thought they needed to cool the plant, and the other one they needed to heat up the plant. And because the plant was so complicated, they had a misconception as to which one to pull. and they pulled Miller instead of Budweiser, and we came very, very close to nuclear meltdown. I think what Michael's told us today is that we need to figure out ways of testing our knowledge base, our students' knowledge base, rather than their fact base. But in any case, are there any questions that you all have to Michael? Candace.
Well, so there's tons of programming languages, and many of them, there must be more than one that's relevant to material science. How did you select the programming languages to introduce into your courses?
Okay, so the question was, how did we choose the programming language we decided to teach? And in this case, we decided to use MATLAB. And the reason we decided to use MATLAB, even though it's not sort of typical compiled programming language that one would learn in a computer science department, is that MATLAB comes with a lot of capability to represent data graphically, to build graphic user interfaces, the kinds of things that are really important for engineers to be able to do once they're done with their computing class.
So it's a reinforcing kind of computing
Well, it's an
language.
enabling tool in addition to learning to program. Because learning to program, the important thing is learning what an algorithm is, learning how to write an algorithm, how to debug an algorithm. You could learn that in any number of computer languages, and it's actually fairly easily portable to other computer languages. Once you know one, you can easily teach yourself that.
Okay, yes.
So Michael, I'm one of these people who believe that if I want to learn my physics, I'm going to learn it from a physics professor, not from a mechanical engineering professor. If I want to learn like computing, I want to learn it from a computer science professor. But you're telling me that no, the better model seems to be to have somebody in material science teach programming. Say more.
Well, okay. Well, I have a master's in computer science. So the question is, why should we have material scientists teach programming? Why not have physicists teach physics, computer scientists teach computer science? And I think that it's true, particularly in the upper divisions, that when you get into the core of a field, of course you want to learn the core of the field from the people who really are deep experts in that field. But I think computing is more than an intellectual exercise for the engineering students. It's not enough for them to understand what an algorithm is, what algorithmic complexity is, you know, the basic bare bones. They have to see how do they get from A to Z. How is this integral in my conception of myself as an engineer? And I think for the computer scientists, they certainly get that when they're in a computer science-based class. But I'm not sure many of the engineers get that. I mean, I think it could be taught by computers.
Equal to that, it should be them considered teaching calculus as well as engineering.
I've heard that voiced by more than one person, that we should be teaching calculus and engineering.
I'm against it, but it looks like that for disability.
Okay, one more question.
Well, so speaking as a computer scientist, I have to say the first part of your talk I disagree with completely because I love all those sorting algorithms. But actually, just following up on what Sanjeev said, so I mean, you tested in some sense their end goal of learning the topic in their class. But I guess another interesting question is you could flip it around and say, if I were going to teach computer science, could I actually teach computer science better by having those domains actually out there as a way of driving what I'm trying to teach?
Right. I mean,
I'm wondering if you've looked at that at all.
I think it's a very interesting question because I think one of the things we tend to do in engineering without thinking about it very much, just because of the structure of our disciplines, is we silo students as soon as they come in. And so the material science students don't often, you know, material scientists, when they go out into the real world, they're rarely on a team of all material scientists. They're usually the material scientists in a team of everybody. And I think the same for computer scientists. Like, they may go into a team and they have to write a program understanding the physics. And, you know, I think in the first year is actually maybe an ideal time to bring the students together and make them work cross-discipline, because then it contextualizes what they do for the rest of their time they're on campus.
Okay, terrific. So in one of my slides, I talked about information overload. And Charles is now going to blow that idea out of the water when he talks to us about Gabriel Montero, who's one of the world's most gifted concert pianists who can compose full concerts spontaneously. Charles can tell us how she does that.
what an honor to be here tonight. It's such a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you. When my daughter was about 4, an older relative asked me if I'd reached the parenting stage where I was convinced my child was a genius. And I was like, kind of, she's starting to utter a few words and she can walk, and yeah, she might be. And so it made me realize that we know very little about what genius actually means. And so I think it's relevant to us here at Hopkins because we're kind of in the business of genius. What I mean by that, a lot of the things that we're trying to teach to our students, it's the collective genius of our time, just aggregated through really centuries of information. The best ideas distilled into a few courses, a few hours in classroom. Moreover, as faculty members, we're trying to cultivate genius. We hope that we're teaching somebody who is a genius or has the potential to be a genius. And knowing some of you here in the room, I suspect that some of you are geniuses. Now, I've never been one to get hung up on definitions ever, and I think genius is one of those sort of like pornography. You kind of know when you see one. But I don't know if anybody here can define what a genius really is. And I think that if we kind of go through the history of our geniuses, one thing's for sure, we've never had the chance to study them. I mean, we've learned from our geniuses through their work, but not really from them, not with the opportunity to look at their brains. And so, I think the first obvious genius that comes to mind is this fellow, Albert Einstein. Now, why do we think of Einstein as a genius? I think it's a couple of things. One is his enormous intellectual contribution. So I think you have to think that somebody who's a genius has extreme intellect, extreme intelligence. But I don't think that's it. It just can't be limited to that. There has to be something else. This degree of insight, this ability to see something new, something that wasn't recognized before, to kind of flip things around internally. I think there has to be a degree of creativity mixed together with this idea of extreme intelligence. So maybe you start to see that these things are both necessary for us to say, okay, this person might be a genius. And I think if we head over to the musical world, this is Beethoven. Why do we consider Beethoven a genius? Not because he was an amazing piano player. He was a great piano player. But we don't remember him. We remember him for what he created that was new. And so I think creativity has to be, especially now if we look at the realm of what constitutes a musical genius, I think the idea of generating new ideas has to be a core part of this idea to give us something that we didn't have before. And I think that's true whether or not it's Beethoven, whether or not it's Miles Davis. And why do we like jazz, or why do we revere our jazz idols? Not because they played the melody great, because they made the melody new. They changed the melody, they improvised on the melody. And now, how many of you have children that play piano? Okay, good. Some of you. You probably have a photo similar to this. And so we get to this 8-year-old girl. Now, what's different about this than, you probably sat through some recitals that were pretty painful. Yeah, it's half an hour more and then we can leave. This is kind of what this girl's doing. However, this photo is from 1978, and this girl's a prodigy. Okay? She is premiering Haydn with the Simon Bolivar Youth Orchestra in Venezuela. And she was really good. Here she is being interviewed to talk about what her favorite composer is.
So
she just said that Chopin was her favorite composer. Now, why was she being interviewed? Because just previously she had, this is now at the age of 11, she had played the Grieg piano concerto, and here she is. Yeah, age of 11. And, you know, that's enough to make you want to quit piano if you're trying to. So, for me, when I watch it, I think, okay, but you know what? She's still, a prodigy does not make a genius. It's potential. But something else happened, which is that she started playing all around the world. This is who she is today, Gabrielle Montero, born in 1970. But what she was doing as she played around the world was not just playing the score. Okay? As she began to be conscious, she started, as Karen said, improvising at sometimes the entire concert. Typically what she would do is play a half program that was scheduled and then a half program completely improvised. So here she is improvising on Mozart. Okay, so again, now for those of you that are not musical in the audience, it's hard to understand what that means if you're improvising on Mozart. So let me give you a little more concrete example. So she is traveling all around the world. What she's doing is saying, okay, she comes out, she says to the audience, give me a theme, any theme to play with, and let's play some music based on that theme. She doesn't know what she's going to play. She's never played it before that way, and she's just going to improvise on it. And so here's her showing how she does this with Jingle Bells. So maybe now when you hear that, you can think, genius. And so, for me, as a music addict, I'm a total music addict. When I hear that, I really wonder about the how of things. And how is it that somebody can do that? And I think that it's worth pointing out that improvisation is probably not a new concept. And keep in mind, she's been very controversial in the classical musical. Classical musical is conservative. I don't really like the world to be too much. And she is sort of flipping it around on its head a little bit by saying, you know what, the concert can be improvised, more in the style of a jazz musician in a sense. Now this is a flute. This is thought to be maybe the world's oldest musical instrument. Now, let's look at the data. It's 35,000 years ago. 35,000 years ago. Try to imagine living 35 years ago and then 350 years ago. 35,000 years ago, why are human beings making musical instruments? Why do we care? Does it help them survive? It doesn't help them get food. It doesn't help them really live. And somehow, it matters to them. Moreover, what are they playing? There's no radio, there's no repertoire, there's no teacher, there's no sheet music, there's no scores, there's no concerts. What are they playing? They're probably making up music. So I think the first music was really improvised. And so I think there's a strong argument that improvisation, rather than being a kind of unusual exception, is maybe more part of the hardwired human element of why we seek and create music. We need to generate art. In every human society, throughout history, there's always been art. There's always been an impulse to create something new. I think that is part of what makes us essentially human. And I think that music is maybe just one example, but a nice one, because you can kind of hear these things coming together. It doesn't require language. I always say that I don't even need to speak. Just listen to her play. That will be enough. You'll get it. And so I think it comes down to the brain, which is that the brain in humans has this instinct that we want to create new ideas. But at the same time, we, meaning the community, neuroscientists, educators, we know very little about how the brain actually does this. We don't know what any genius's brain functions like. We would love to know that information. So how did Einstein come up with this great idea? How did Da Vinci do this? No idea. It's somewhat something from the ether. We say, well, we really don't know how we did this. It would be kind of cool if we knew. But today, if you could identify a genius, if you could, and work with them, you might be able to understand the brain, because it's the brain that makes the genius. And so we have this idea in the lab that artistic creativity, yes, it's an amazing thing. I love it. I revere it. But that it's a neurologic product. Okay? So it's a product of the brain. So let's study this part of the brain the way we study every other complex neurologic process that emanates from the brain. Let's not put it on a pedestal as far as neuroscience goes. Let's design experiments respectfully, but let's try to experiment with this product called art. And functional MRI is what I use in the lab usually. This is an interesting modality because it's just like a regular MRI. However, it's also very magnetic, so you can't go in there with a tuba. Okay, it's not going to work. It's a big magnet. It's also very tight, so you have to be spatially confined. You have to stay still. It's extremely noisy. Maybe the worst environment to play music. However, one of the best environments to sit in to capture real-time brain activity. And so, when I was at the NIH for a few years, I worked on a piano that we could use during fMRI. Here's a short video of how that works.
So this is a plastic MIDI piano keyboard that we use for the jazz experiments. And it's a 35-key keyboard that is designed to take both inside the scanner, be magnetically safe, have minimal interference that would contribute to any artifact, and have this cushion that it can rest on the player's legs while they're lying down in the scanner playing on their back. And it works like this. This doesn't actually produce any sound. It sends out what's called a MIDI signal, or a digital interface, through these wires in the box of the computer, which then trigger high-quality piano samples like this.
So I'm going to demo it for you. There's a double mirror that I'm using to flip my hands back. And now I'm going to play the blues. This is memorized. This is improvised. Maybe from that simple idea that you could set up two complex activities that differ only by virtue of one being spontaneously generated and one being overlearned, that you could isolate this idea of what happens to the brain when somebody's having a creative idea. And so that's the core idea with which Gabriela Montero approached me in the lab. Basically, we got an email from her group asking if she could come to the lab because they were doing a documentary on her and they wanted to study what she does, why she does it, and how she does it. And they knew what she did, they knew why she did it. They had no idea how she did it. And so I said, sure, come to the lab and let's see what we can do. So we set up this exact kind of thing. Now, it's ludicrous to do single subject fMRI, okay? I know that. On the other hand, it's ludicrous to try to average Gabriela Montero with anybody else. So I don't know, there are not 9 other subjects that fit the criteria. So I didn't know what to do. I was say, okay, let's try it. It's been done before. I realized it's fraught with difficulty, but let's try it. Let's try to get something rather than nothing. And so I think in general with science, especially of this nature, you have to be realistic with your expectations. And I am the worst skeptic about fMRI. It's a really strange modality, and the more you use it, the more you feel its limitations. Yet, you can't help but realize that it kind of works. I mean, like you kind of learn about the brain and what it's doing, these really amazing, complex human behaviors. And so I think improvisation is one of them. The other thing to keep in mind is it's very hard to isolate what should be an appropriate control condition. Having control for music. It's science and music, they don't really go that well when you're thinking about improvisation. But yet you can still set a very complex control condition, playing something memorized, and then a further, even more sophisticated condition like creativity, and look at the differences. And so Gabriela came here, she's in the mock scanner practicing. She's using that piano. And then, again, here is her playing a control condition. We picked something that many of you probably heard before. And then other times we would ask her to improvise.
Improvise.
We did this over and over again over the course of about 70 minutes. And so we kept measuring her brain over and over again. And what we found is that, wow, playing minuet and G is a pretty amazing neurologic activity. Look at all these things that are involved. I mean, it's a complex, it requires the whole brain to play minuet and G. It should. It's not that, I mean, it's not that simple a thing for the brain to achieve. But when she's improvising, her brain is quite literally on fire. I mean, a lot is happening in her brain. If you actually look at the differences between the two, you realize that, wow, when you switch from doing a complex musical task and then make that task a creative one, this brain is ramping up in activity in almost every sensory motor cortex. Again, these are both very similar activities. It's just that one is new and one is not new. And so this, I think, has something to do with what we should maybe think about in this idea of genius. Maybe geniuses go into a mode in a brain, because I'm sure that Einstein wasn't necessarily a genius when he was washing the dishes. But you can enter a brain state where your brain is ramped up, it kind of primes itself and ramps up, multiplies itself into a higher mode. This is what we're seeing with it. If we do functional connectivity analysis, we'll see that all of the connections between the centers of the brain for memory, emotion, reward coding, auditory, mental imagery, emotion, they're all stronger with improvisation than in memorized performance. The connections are, the brain is much more carefully integrated during this creative performance. Now, I think that I've said, I really have said very little about what makes her a genius. I don't know. Okay? However, I think that we can start to ask the right questions, and we can start to get some investigations where we can say, all right, if we could identify at Johns Hopkins who the geniuses are, maybe we can look at their brains and figure out how their brains are working. Because ideally, we would like to be able to shape human brains to be more like geniuses. And we would like to harness the creative potential in humans in some way. And first thing is to try to identify what that brain is doing. These are questions that I'm thinking about in the lab. What is neurobiology of genius? Do we acquire it? Are we born with it? Does it change over our lifetime? Is brain pathology, disorders, depression, disease, are these things linked to genius in some fundamental way that can teach us how to make why genius bring difference? And then lastly, how can we enhance creativity? This, I think, is the crux of it all. If we could just describe the neural structure of genius, we should be able to modulate it with neurochemistry, with drugs. There should be, 100 years from now, a creativity pill. And you take it when you want to be more genius. and maybe one day that will be standard fare at a place like Hopkins, because we are in the business of genius. And so with that in mind, I want to thank all the people in the lab that contributed to this work there on the left, and then also Gavin Montero generously for her time. And thank you all for your attention.
Thanks, Charles. Questions, please.
So, may I ask a obvious question to start? So, take a normal person, put them in your scanner, who's not a genius, but you say, play something from memory and then do something creative, and you look to see what the differences are.
Yes.
Is there really more recruiting in the brain than is the average person's psyche?
Thank you for the question. So the question was, is there, if you take a normal person doing these things and then look at the differences, is there really more creative? One problem with this is that normal people can't do this task. Meaning it's very hard to have an amateur or someone who's not really good, or a student who doesn't really kind of do this kind of a complex task where you're improvising for 70 minutes. I don't have a great answer to that. I will tell you that every fMRI experiment I've done, including 9-year-old children, to caricature artists, to rap artists, to jazz musicians, the creative brain and the rote brain are different. That is clearly the case. How they differ is dependent on many things. It seems like emotional state or emotional target matters. It seems like level of expertise matters a lot. I think that I can't give you a full answer of this is only one subject. I can tell you that for her, she is exhibiting to me what are some surprising patterns in that her prefrontal cortex is deactivated during all conditions. That surprised me. But I do think that the more analysis we do here, this is fairly amusing. We're going to find that there's some things that are just unique to her that we're not seeing in our amateur conditions, where every condition is very effortful. The way she described it, provided to me, it's like turning on a faucet. Just go. And then it's over. It's like shutting off the faucet. It's done. I mean, she can do it all day long.
Well, I was curious, did you study her without the physical movement? So imagine yourself playing piece A. Now imagine yourself playing piece 2.
Thanks for the question. So the question was, did I study her without her actually moving, her imagining the pieces of the improvisation? We did not, and I'll tell you why we didn't. It's a really intriguing idea. The problem is that you have no output measure. And so we have no way to verify what they thought. Okay, and so she can say, wow, you should have heard that. It's really I have no idea what she thought. Now, like, I would like to do that experiment somehow, because I think that mental, imagining or sort of anticipated creativity is a really interesting question. But for something like her, where we really, her motor output is so critical to what she does, we started off at least with the question of her just playing. There are about 100 questions you could come up with that are all very intriguing. And she's actually willing to come back. She lives in Los Angeles. She's willing to come back. So I think that we're going to try to line up a series of experiments moving forward. That might be one.
2 more questions.
Great talk. I have a question maybe on yourself. You're in the School of Medicine, but you're also in the School of Music.
Yes.
So the idea of scientists and music blending together as individuals, could you maybe reflect on that a little bit, and the idea of how creativity would go into perhaps science in a way, or medicine, and have you explored that as well?
Thank you for the question. So I'm an ear surgeon. I'm a hearing specialist. So I went into medicine because of a deep love for music. That sounds strange, but so I love music so much that I never thought I could or should do it, because I would listen to John Coltrane and Miles Davis, and when I pick up my sax, I shouldn't do that. But on the other hand, there were parallels for me. So I felt like, especially as a teenager, that music was about kind of existential life and death. And then when I got to medicine, I was like, no, this is about life and death. And there was some immediate parallels to me that it kind of, in some way, inspired the same part of my brain when I was thinking about the two. And then surgery is very much like playing a musical instrument. It's very flow. We're not overly creative in the OR, but you have to have the facility to be creative when there's a problem. And so I would say that there are a lot of people in the medical campus that are very creative, but they're harnessing it in very sort of ways that you wouldn't necessarily think of as artistic. And vice versa, I think that there are many people that are in art who are essentially doing mathematics with sound or mathematics with paint. They're very structural in their work. Bach's are so architectural. It's so like magnificently mathematical. And so I think that the parallels run deep. For myself, it's the only way I kind of know how to live, and I'm so lucky at Hopkins to be able to pursue both together.
This is getting a little bit late. How about if we have the questions when we meet outside for Charles? In the meantime, all the rage today is a one-on-one thing, which means that schools are giving students on their first day of class iPads or laptops. In fact, a colleague of mine was all excited because Cornell Medicine is now giving all their incoming students iPads, and they've had a survey which tells them, the administration, that students are coming to Cornell Medical School because of the iPads, which is a bizarre view. In any case, we're very lucky to have Thomas Dolby join us. And there's certainly very few of us who have had exposure to such sophisticated equipment as Thomas has had. Yet, what does he like best? His reel-to-reel TIAC from 20 years ago, and he's going to tell us why.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me. I'm working on a book concept, and I don't really know if it works or not. So I thought I would experiment and you guys. So thank you for being my guinea pigs. The concept is basically this: that over the years that I've been playing synthesizer, the advances in electronic music technology have kind of mapped to Moore's law, computing, which you're very familiar with. But as the numbers have doubled over the years, I almost feel that my creative impulse as a musician has sort of diminished every time there's been a significant leap in the numbers. Because Moore's law is generally considered to be a good thing, right? 4-bit goes to 8-bit, goes to 16-bit, ooh, here comes 64-bit, before you know it. And this is assumed to be a good thing, a desirable thing. And so every time a new product is announced, everybody gets very excited about it. And I always felt that in some ways, looking back, I was at my most creative when I was very limited. So here I am teaching at Hopkins for the first time in my life. How am I supposed to teach students that progress is actually a bad thing? You're supposed to teach them that, in fact, to get in touch with your inner creativity, in a lot of ways, it's good to go backwards. I'm in the film department. What am I suggesting? We go back to 16mm Bolexes, and that everybody gets rid of their big LCD TVs and goes back to a black and white set with sort of fuzzy lines all over it. No, I'm not suggesting that. I just feel that from my own point of view, I was at my happiest when things were still quite simple. And I think one of the reasons for this is that I was never a particularly gifted piano player. Certainly, needless to say, not up to Gabriella's standards, and barely even, dare I say, up to Charles Lynn's standards. So part of it was that I like being limited. I have a sort of somewhat sort of arthritic style of piano playing. 4 fingers is good for me, and so I come back to this number 4 quite often. And so when I was thinking about my talk tonight, I was thinking of giving it, straightforward titles like less is more or small is beautiful. But in the end, I opted for the infinitely more concise and catchy title of The Road to MIDI Hell is paved with great inventions. And Charles talked a bit about MIDI, which is the sort of communication language of electronic music instruments. Now, those of you that have been involved in marketing or technology marketing may be familiar with this curve here for the traditional technology adoption life cycle attributed to one Everett Rogers back in the 1940s. So I think he was actually talking about combine harvesters in the prairie states, not about computers. But on this chart, you'll see the techies and the visionaries over here, and then this huge bell curve, the pragmatics and the conservatives, ending up with the laggards over here. And everybody sort of visualizes themselves somewhere in this sort of area. And when I was 19 years old, I also visualized myself in this area. And here I was, age 19, in bed playing an early synthesizer, an early polyphonic synthesizer. And like most 19-year-olds, I believed that all that had to happen was the world would hear my music and I'd be an overnight superstar, right? Little did I know. The reality is the music industry was going to sort of get in the way. What was going on in London at the time when I was that age was the winter of discontent. There were riots, riot police in the streets, there was a general strike, terrible power outages, the garbage was piling up on the sidewalks, and people left the most amazing things in skips on street corners. And it was in one of these skips that I found this circuit board for a Transcendent 2000, which is a kit-built synthesizer that had originally been published in Popular Electronics. And so I managed to take this thing home, solder it together, and build this Transcendent 2000, my first synthesizer. It had no keyboard, and in fact, the only way really to get sound out of it was to use sort of little cables that you connect up to 8-volt cables. But before long, Moog, who had previously made these fabulous synthesizers that were the sole domain of sort of university music departments and recording studios and rich rock stars and so on, came out with an affordable model called the Micro Moog synthesizer. And this was my first all-in-one synth with a keyboard. And it was monophonic, meaning that you could play one note at a time, aka one voice at a time. You couldn't play chords, even the arthritic 4-note chords on this. You could play one note at a time. And I had a lot of fun in my bedsitter apartment in South London, improvising on this thing. And it was hard to make sort of complete music with it, especially the kind of complete music using synthesizers that I was hearing coming out of Germany with bands like Kraftwerk, and that was being experimented with by some of my pop heroes like David Bowie and Brian Eno and so on. And around about the same time, I got my first rhythm unit, which was actually made by Roland, who were at the time an organ company. And I think to help their organists play the rumba and the cha-cha-cha, they came out with this device. And so this is really the second black box that I got, was this Boss Doctor rhythm. And then I got my first tape recorder, which was a stereo tape recorder, so 1 goes to 2, because what you could do with the Micro Moog was program a sound, let's say a kick drum, and you sit there, you roll the tape recorder, and you sit there going, then you wind the tape back, and you bounce track 1 to track 2, program in a snare drum sound, and you add the kick drum to the snare drum. So now you've got, and that was my drum track. So I was getting excited by the expanded creative possibilities, I thought, and I just wanted more. I just wanted more sounds, more voices. So then out came this TIAC 4-track Porter Studio, and this actually used a standard cassette tape but it played at double speed, and instead of using 2 tracks on either side, it used all 4 tracks. And you could actually not only bounce between tracks, but you could do a full-scale mix. And I was able to do some fairly sophisticated home demos with this.
Try to design the stuff that's in your body.
So that was basically using the tools that I had. Now that particular demo, I sent out cassette tapes of it to various record companies and producers and so on. It attracted the attention of a band called Foreigner. And Paul Matthews is going to love this segment of the story. I was invited, age 19, to go from Europe to New York to play on an album called Foreigner 4. The problem was they'd heard my demos. My suspicion is they felt rather guilty because they kind of ripped off one of my demos. They did a song called Urgent, which miraculously they came up with right after my song Urgent came out. I think sort of out of pity they invited me to go and play their album. So I flew to New York. I'd never really been hired professionally as a keyboard player before. And I found myself in the Electric Lady Studios. The problem was they were already up against the clock, a deadline, to get their album finished. So they put me in a back room at Electric Lady Studios to add keyboard sounds to their album. I only had a monophonic synthesizer, right? But I had this idea that I always wanted to try out. You may have heard of a keyboard called the Mellotron. And the Mellotron is what the Beatles used on Strawberry Fields Forever and things like that. The white box with standard keyboard, but behind each key was a tape loop. So you would have, let's say, a flute sound. So the flute would play an A, and they'd record it and make a loop out of it. And when you held down the key, it would replay this recording of a flute playing an A. So you could play chords with it. Well, I'd never played a Mellotron before, but I always had this idea that if you had a multi-track tape recorder, you could take single notes and put one note on each one of the different tracks of the multi-track tape recorder, and then actually play the faders instead of a keyboard. So I'd had this idea, I've been dreaming about this for several years. Here I was up all night in Electric Lady in the back room, and I knew the band weren't coming back in until the morning. And so I got to experiment with it, and I came up with an intro for one of their songs, which I never thought they would take very seriously. In fact, when the drummer from the band first heard it, he said, "What is this, massage music?" But anyway, this was the intro that I created. Now, the guys that invented that lovely Neve sidecar mixing board, I'm sure never envisaged this use for it. But in a way, the limitations that I had there sort of prompted me to come up with a new way to skin a cat. Now, not long after that, the first polyphonic synthesizer started to show up. And this is the first commercially available one of them, the Roland Jupiter 4. There are only a few hundred of them in the UK at the time, and I got a hold of one of the first of them. You couldn't play different sounds with the 4 different notes, but you could, for the first time, actually play chords. And so I started to go out live and play what went from 4 to 8. This is the Roland Jupiter 8 that came out shortly afterwards. And with that, I did entire concerts. Also on stage, I had this rather wonderful Simmons box, which came in a suitcase. It had 7 pads, but you could play 8 by banging on the actual flight case itself. So then I came up with this kind. This is actually, this machine was a PPG 340 380 wave computer. It's actually designed to work Tangerine Dream's light shows. And so you could use it to actually sequence music because it had these 2 microcassette decks in it, and each song had a pair of microcassettes. So my show at the time, the beginning of each song consisted of taking a pair of microcassettes, popping them in, hitting load, which took 52 seconds, at the end of which there was roughly a 50% chance that the program would run. So any chops that I may have as a public speaker came from those days when I had to sort of come up with entertaining talks in units of 52 seconds. On a good day, only 1 unit. On a bad day, 3 or 4. So I took my live show out, and it attracted quite a lot of attention in the UK and Europe, but absolutely none in the USA. So she was 12 on the travels, as is one, you're all I took my Roland Duke Threat and my stage show around the world to places like Japan, where I was actually given an award called Young Scientist of the Year, and to Holland, where they decided that I had a Vista plan. But still no success to speak of in the USA, but while I was out there on the road, I penned a little ditty, which really I'd done because I wanted to make a music video. And I was desperate for my record company to give me the budget to make a music video. So I sort of wrote the storyboard for the music video, and then they said, well, where's the song? And I said, well, I'll bring it in on Monday. And I went home over the weekend and wrote the song. This actually led to sort of more commercial success, which took me somewhat by surprise, but meant that I got to work with some of my own musical heroes. A couple of whom, Charles, I think you need to get in your fMRI. Let's do it, yeah. The Thompson twins, and played with a bunch of other people using these 8-voice synthesizers at this point. Very excellent and totally overlooked in the USA pre-type Sprout. Around about that time, synthesizers started to go digital, and this was very exciting because it overcame a lot of the limitations of analog synths, like the fact that they never stayed in tune, for example. Digital synths were better at staying in tune, but had a somewhat watery sound to my ears. But when this one came out, which had 16 voices, I found to my delight that there was a way to actually use those 16 oscillators on only 4 notes. So you have 4 oscillators per note. And this created a rather wonderful sort of interaction between the oscillators, producing a rather nice organic sort of bell-like sound. And with that, I created this song. As you may have noticed, that last song, the main chord sequence, there are overdubs on it, but the main chord sequence was just those 4 notes. So, I constantly had this impulse to go back to this number of 4, for my arthritic keyboard playing. And I always found that if those limits were taken away, that it somehow just felt wrong, it just felt good to go back to this number of 4. So I used this in a bunch of other records, like With the Cars.
Single in the sky, impossible,
As opposed to I shot at Live Aid at Wembley Stadium from behind my keyboard. Dave was a big fan of my new beatnik look. said, Peabody, that would be a great name for a tech company. No, he didn't really. Okay, so then from there I wanted to play with Skywatch and Waters, and MIDI was coming in at this point. It's a universal way to talk between different instruments. And that was kind of good, but the problem was it meant that everything was getting very homogenized. 6 different manufacturers were all coming out with basically the same unit. And if you didn't like making do with one, you could just take a MIDI cord and connect it to another. But one of the neat things about that was it sort of separated the actual guts of the synthesizer from the keyboard, which is what allowed Charles to play his 35-note keyboard in his MRI. So when I played at the Wall in Berlin, I was playing a little guitar remote, and I had a stack of keyboard modules backstage. Cindy Lauper was on stage with there. Talk us all about me. So then, along with the machine, I changed So the Fairlight CMI looks more like a device that belongs to the medical campus at Hopkins. It was a sampler, meaning that instead of synthesizing notes, you could actually take chunks of real instruments, or in fact, real other songs. And you were limited to playing 8 of them at the same time. So it wasn't really a coincidence that we were able to make songs and some chunks of other songs, because they've been doing it in places like the South Bronx for years. Wrapper up the beat for a rap group called Krieger. The one thing about music was that I never actually met the group. I was an other member. I created the background on a series of floppy disks, which I sent to New York by courier, and then the band rapped over the top of it. So here was another new concept really in music, the idea of musicians being in different places at the same time. And it was around about that time that I met somebody who became one of the ultimate exponents of this guy Malcolm McLaren. You know him as the inventor of the Sex Pistols, as a sort of fashion maven and so on. He made an amazing album in the middle of the 80s called Duck Rock, which I played on, and he and Trevor Horn went all around the world collecting samples, and we brought them back to London and put together tunes. Now, I never had the budget to sort of go multi-track recording around the world, but I liked the idea of going collecting samples. So the way I used to do it was I had a little DAT, portable DAT recorder, which is a digital audio format that sort of succeeded cassette tapes. And I went to places like the Louisiana Bayou, and in the back of a music store there, with my portable DAT recorder, I took a bunch of samples, which I brought home one track at a time, successively on this tape to Los Angeles, and then reconstituted a multi-track tape using SMPTE timecode. So I put together a 24-track tape using these individual samples. this was the end of the 80s, and as we went into the 90s, things started to get really a lot easier, really because of the affordability of computers. So everything I've been using up to that point really was very, very custom. The Fairlight, for example, cost me, I think, £90,000. In the same year, I bought a flat in central London for £14,000. So, you know, during the course of the 80s, as machines like the Mac got more affordable, it became possible to start doing computer music on consumer instruments. And that meant basically that for the first time really in my life, there were thousands of other people out there that had essentially the same tools for making music as me. There were dedicated programs which would allow you to sequence MIDI on computers and play it out to your synthesizers, such as these, which gradually became more sophisticated over time. You can add bits of audio in with your MIDI and chop them up and cut and paste audio, and instead of recording a whole 5 minutes of music, you could just take a 2-bar loop and play it, cut and paste it over and over again. And these got more and more sophisticated. You've got Pro Tools, which started to replace multi-track tapes, recording studios and on film sets and so on. And what you ended up with was my own MacBook, which, you know, is basically far, far more sophisticated than the professional recording studio that I went to in Electric Lady, you know, 20 years earlier. And that's just the stuff on my MacBook. And interestingly, the whole metaphor that's used, you know, for these incredible pieces of software and plugins is entirely based and modeled on the same devices that I had back in Electric Lady. You know, you have a Hammond organ, you have a valve limiter, you have a mixing board with faders and so on. And the whole metaphor carried over from those days. And yet you put this whole thing for a couple of $100, you know, worth of software that people can add into their computers. So you're sort of expecting the average musician to also be a full-fledged sound engineer, because those are the metaphors that just sort of carry over. And I found this kind of frustrating, and I felt that the whole space was getting a little bit sort of claustrophobic somehow. So I decided to start making my own software, because I felt this impulse once again to back up, you know, to go back to the simplicity that really turned me on. So in 1992, I formed my own software company called Headspace. And our product was a software synthesizer. Now there were some other software synthesizers out there at the time, such as the ones that I showed you on the MacBook. But the idea of ours was that it would be small enough and efficient enough that you could download it over the internet. The whole synthesizer you could download over the internet in a few seconds, and you could play it within your web browser. And this had a couple of advantages. One was that it took away the sort of need to distribute a product altogether, because people could just, you know, hit a certain web page and it would automatically download into their browser. And then the second thing was that because it was fully interactive, it essentially used the same language that HTML used. When you look at a web page, you're not looking at a compressed graphic, you're looking at a series of little icons and graphics and text and a description language sent over the internet. This is a very efficient way to do it, much better than sending a PDF or a JPEG or something like that. And so MIDI and samples is a description language firing off these chunks of media. So we decided to use the same mode, basically, to create a software synthesizer. And it started in the middle of the 90s to actually get downloaded in large numbers. And this gave us the ability to create very, very fancy web pages, working with professional pop artists, which would allow users completely for free and in their own web browser to do things like create their own mixes of famous pop songs and send their mixes to their friends. And there was also an API that allowed musicians themselves to create their own interfaces. So working with 9 Inch Nails, we came up with this one, which basically used the QWERTY keys on your keyboard to allow you to mute and unmute tracks. You could create your own remix on the fly of a 9 Inch Nails track and send it to all of your friends. All you were sending was like a simple block of text, you know, a few bits and bytes long, and then on the client side it would reconstitute. Well, this technology was very new at the time. It was fabulously popular. Tens of millions of people downloaded the Beatnik plugin, and we had incredible press releases and launch parties and satin tour jackets, and we made absolutely no money whatsoever. That started to change right at the very end of the 90s, because we realized that devices were really the future, and unlike the web, consumers seemed to be willing to actually pay for content on mobile phones and devices. And so the first thing that we did was sort of abstract our engine and licensed it to Sun. And so it became the audio layer of Java, which was sort of became ubiquitous towards the end of the 90s. The next deal that we did, which thankfully saved our bacon when most of the dot-coms were going up in smoke, was that we licensed it to these guys, Nokia. They were at the time, they had like 43% market share or something like that in the mobile phone market. They'd seen Japanese mobile phones coming out that had Yamaha MIDI chips in them. Didn't want to pay Yamaha a couple of bucks per unit for a sound chip. And so they came to us and asked us if we could get a synthesizer, a version of the big synthesizer working on their rather puny CPUs in their mass market cell phones. And we sent a bunch of engineers over to Helsinki, and we were desperate to find out how many voices they could get going of the synthesizer on a mass market Nokia phone, and it turned out the answer was 4. So I guess I was rather delighted with this. I was very pleased about that, and they embedded the technology, and basically every Nokia phone since about 1999 has shipped with the Peabody technology on it. It doesn't just synthesize the ringtones, it also sort of mixes the voice sounds and alerts and beeps and blips and so on. So, I mean, actually it became rather uninteresting to me at that point. It's more about engineering and sales, and it was no longer very creative. So, the long and the short of it was that, you know, mid-2000s, I retired from that world. I moved back to England, to a tiny little village on the coast where I grew up, which has 20 houses and a population of 23. And in my garden there, I built a new recording studio in a converted 1930s ship's lifeboat called the Nutmeg of Consolation. And this was powered entirely by renewable technology. I would sit on my roof using power from a wind turbine and a solar panel and play very happily with my arthritic fingers. If there was enough wind or sun during the course of the day, I could store up power and I could be up all night composing. And I was very, very happy in my lifeboat. Started to write music again after quite a few years off. And before long I thought, well, I've got enough songs for an album here. Album. An interesting concept. Nobody seems to really buy albums. I mean, they're not buying albums. They're downloading songs for free, and they're playing games, and they're doing social media and stuff like that. So I thought, okay, what I'm creating here is not actually an album per se. It could be all of those other things. It's just a collection of music. And so I started thinking about what this should be if it wasn't an album. And from the control room of my studio, I used to perv these rather amazing container ships that go in and out of Felixstowe, one of the largest ports in Europe, close to me. And when the light catches them just right, they look sort of like floating cities. And so I started to dream up this concept of the floating city, which was a sort of dystopian future where it was too hot to exist on land. And so the only way to survive was to push out the hulls of these abandoned ships and get out towards the North Pole where it was cooler. And so I came up with this idea that going back to the web browser, I could create a social network game that would be the way people got this music. So it wouldn't be a CD anymore, it would be a game. It would be a social network, it would be a game. And the way that this worked, now I guess I could have hired a team of programmers to write it from scratch, but I rather like the fact that, you know, once again, limitations would let me create it. So I found that Google Maps actually has an ability to overlay your own graphics on top of the Google Maps. So I found a Google map of the North Pole, and I got an artist to draw me his impression of what the North Pole would look like in the future when the polar ice cap is gone. And I came up with this idea for a game where basically all the users would go in, and each one would have one of these black dots, which is actually, in Google Map terms, it's one of those pins that you stick in when you want to, you know, remember a location of Google Maps. And the idea of the game was that by trading music with your partners, with your neighbors, you could sort of push your vessel out northwards and converge on the North Pole, creating the floating city, which Stephen Levitt described as sort of a cross between Freakonomics and Burning Man. And one of the inhabitants of the North City was this guy, the Lost Airman. And the Lost Airman used to put out this sort of spreadsheet, and basically the users would sort of come up with their own conspiracy theories about what the heck was going on in this world. And I had no plan at this point. You know, they would write stuff, And I would lurk around their user groups, and every now and then if somebody wrote something cool, the Floating City Gazette would publish it and it became the truth. So that was how I sort of proceeded with that. And then I toured with the game and the album, and this was the time capsule, which I towed around behind my tour bus. The time capsule was very popular when we parked it outside venues, partly because of the ladies that operated it, Laura and Pandora, and the fact that most of my fans are sort of middle-aged white guys. So speaking of middle-aged white guys, what the time capsule would allow you to do was to sit down and record a message to the future, which would get automatically uploaded to YouTube. And so we got a bunch of sort of fans while they were queuing up. We also got some celebrity people like Bill Nye, the science guy, uploading messages to the future in their time capsule. I then took out on the road a film that I made about my village and the lighthouse on the tip of the island there. And it was around about that time that I first spoke to Linda Libero at the film department at Johns Hopkins. And she was aware of some of this stuff, and she was looking for somebody to teach music pitch at Hopkins, and put two and two together, and that's how I ended up here. But I often think back to the way I was when I was 19, and especially when I look at my students and how different their expectations are. I believed back then that the world would hear my music and overnight I'd be a sensation. It was actually a fib in those days, but today, believe it or not, that could really happen. This is Jessie J on her laptop webcam, and this is Jessie 6 months later live on Jimmy Kimmel as an international star. So these days that can actually happen. Meanwhile, all of those applications we were creating, you can get for 99 cents for your iPhone, and I'm not interested in any of that, because I realized something about myself, and that is that, when you look at this curve, the laggards that were originally put over here, and now the guys up here that have got sort of, a couple of hundred different apps on their iPhone that they never use. So I think this curve looks very different. But the curve was modified by Geoffrey Moore in the 50s when he came up with this concept of the chasm. And I feel that, every time I get to that point, I have to back up. But worse comes to worse, I end up at the bottom of the chasm, inventing new stuff. And that's kind of why I'm here hanging out with you guys at Hopkins.
Well, Charles, my take-home message from all of that is you have one more candidate for your FMR election. In any case, let's ask a couple questions, and then we'll go back and have a bite to eat. Okay, let's go back and get a bite to eat. First, Pam's going to give us some closing remarks. Thomas, that was superb.
Thank you. Thanks again for coming. Can we give another round of applause to our three? Before we leave, I want to thank Lacey Henry in the back. She's my assistant. She's done all this work together in just a few weeks. So can we give her a hand? Also, I want to thank all the advisory committees that I do have, and the students that are in here, and the participants, and friends of mine in our family community here. We have launched a website today. It's on your program, so you'll see it on the back. In addition, the Twitter feed, so you can # DigIT and tweet if you want tonight or anything. But again, I want to thank you, and we hope to be a series. Next series will start, it'll be in February, and again, another one in April. So this is just the beginning, and thank you for coming for the inaugural. So in the back, we'll have dessert and more drink and what food's left. And Lacey says yes. So please enjoy yourself and just collaborate with me. Thanks again.
Very nice to meet you. Right at the top. Yeah, see that. And we only work hard. So long.
Yeah.